What if everything you've ever seen, touched, or experienced, your body, your loved ones, the physical world, was not reality itself, but merely an interface, a useful fiction, like the trash can icon on your computer desktop? This is the radical claim of cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman. According to his interface theory of reality, natural selection has systematically hidden the truth from us. Evolution doesn't reward accurate perception. It rewards survival. And these two goals are fundamentally incompatible. Today, we're going to explore how four great philosophers, Immanuel Kant, George Berkeley, Edmund Husserl, and Arthur Schopenhauer, would respond to this contemporary scientific theory. Each anticipated key elements of Hoffman's argument, but they also reveal its limitations and dangers. Donald Hoffman's argument is deceptively simple. Imagine an organism that perceives reality with perfect accuracy, every quantum fluctuation, every particle interaction. This organism would be overwhelmed with useless information. Meanwhile, its competitor sees a simplified interface. That's food. That's danger. That's a potential mate. Which organism survives? The one with the useful interface, not the accurate perception. Hoffman uses computer simulations and evolutionary game theory to demonstrate that organisms tuned for survival will always outcompete organisms tuned for truth. His models suggest that the probability of evolution producing truth-perceiving organisms is zero. Think about your computer desktop. When you drag a file to the trash, you're not literally moving a metal container. You're manipulating a useful symbol that triggers complex computational processes you don't need to understand. The interface hides the reality. Similarly, Hoffman argues, when you see a snake and feel fear, you're not perceiving an actual reptile. You're responding to a survival-relevant interface icon. Space, time, physical objects, even your own body, are all part of this interface. They have no independent existence outside of consciousness. This leads Hoffman to conscious realism. Reality consists entirely of conscious agents interacting with other conscious agents. There is no material foundation. Consciousness is fundamental, and the physical world is an illusion it creates. Immanuel Kant, a German 18th century philosopher and one of the foremost thinkers of the Enlightenment, would find Hoffman's theory both familiar and deeply troubling. Kant's transcendental idealism already established that we can never know things in themselves, what he called noumena. We only know phenomena, things as they appear to us, structured by our cognitive faculties. Space, time, and causality aren't features of reality itself, but organizing principles our minds impose on experience. So far, Kant might seem like Hoffman's philosophical ancestor. But here's where Kant would raise a devastating objection. Kant believed that while we can't know things in themselves, our cognitive faculties are fundamentally rational and truth-oriented. They allow us to achieve objective knowledge within the bounds of possible experience. But Hoffman's evolutionary argument undermines this completely. If our perceptual and cognitive faculties evolved purely for survival rather than truth, then how can we trust our reasoning at all, including the reasoning that led to Hoffman's theory? This is the self-refutation problem. Hoffman uses evolutionary theory, mathematical modeling, and empirical evidence to argue that evolution, mathematics, and empirical evidence are all interface illusions that don't track truth. If Hoffman is right that our cognitive faculties systematically deceive us, then we have no grounds for believing Hoffman's theory is true. The theory undermines its own foundations. Kant would argue that even if our perceptions are evolutionarily shaped interfaces, the logical structures we use to analyze these interfaces must have some validity that transcends mere survival utility. Otherwise, no knowledge would be possible, including knowledge of our own limitations. George Berkeley, Anglo-Irish 18th century philosopher and the father of idealism, would initially feel vindicated by Hoffman's theory. Berkeley's idealism famously denied the existence of matter. His principle esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, claimed that material objects are nothing but collections of ideas in minds. There is no material substance underlying our perceptions. Hoffman's conscious realism sounds remarkably similar. Reality consists entirely of conscious agents and their experiences. The physical world is an interface phenomenon with no independent existence. But Berkeley would quickly recognize a crucial difference. And it's a difference that undermines everything his philosophy stood for. For Berkeley, ideas exist in minds, and the stability of our perceptions are guaranteed by God. The chair in your room continues to exist when you're not looking at it because God is perceiving it. There's an objective foundation, a divine mind that coordinates all finite minds. Hoffman's theory has no such guarantor. Different species might inhabit completely incompatible realities based on their evolutionary history. The bat's echolocation world and our visual world are different interfaces to what exactly? If there's no underlying reality they both relate to, and no divine coordination, then we're left with radical relativism. Berkeley wanted to preserve objective truth by grounding it in the divine mind. Hoffman seems to dissolve objectivity entirely. Berkeley would find this troubling. Hoffman's theory leads to solipsistic pluralism, where every form of consciousness creates its own reality, with no objective standard to adjudicate between them. Arthur Schopenhauer, a great German 19th century philosopher, known for his masterwork, The World as a Will and Representation, which characterizes the phenomenal world as the manifestation of the blind and irrational noumenal will, or simply will to live, would see Hoffman's theory as scientific confirmation of his bleakest philosophical insights. Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation argued that everything we experience, what he called representation, is a veil of Maya, an illusion concealing the true nature of reality. Behind this veil lies the will, a blind, irrational force that drives all existence. For Schopenhauer, our perceptual apparatus doesn't reveal reality but obscures it. We see individual objects separated in space and time, but this individuation is illusory. The underlying reality is unified will, endlessly striving without purpose or satisfaction. Hoffman's evolutionary argument would strike Schopenhauer as merely providing the mechanism for what he already knew philosophically. Evolution is the will operating through time, shaping organisms not for truth, but for survival. But Schopenhauer would push Hoffman's insights in a much darker direction. If your loved ones are interface icons triggering evolved responses for pair bonding and cooperation, if their faces are useful fictions rather than genuine presentations of their inner lives, what happens to the authenticity of human relationships? Schopenhauer wouldn't soft-pedal this implication. He'd argue that Hoffman's theory confirms that authentic human connection, as we normally understand it, is impossible. We're each trapped in our own evolutionary interface, responding to survival-relevant stimuli we mistake for genuine encounters with other consciousnesses. Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, would diagnose a fundamental confusion in Hoffman's entire approach. The problem, Husserl would argue, is that Hoffman remains trapped in what phenomenology calls the natural attitude, the naive assumption that consciousness is something inside a world of independently existing objects. Hoffman asks, how do our perceptions relate to objective reality? And answers, they don't. They're evolutionary interfaces. But Husserl would insist this question itself is confused. Consciousness is not something in the world that might or might not accurately represent other things in the world. Consciousness is the condition for any world appearing at all. It's not a thing, but the activity through which things become present. Husserl's famous principle, consciousness, is always consciousness of something. It's inherently intentional, directed toward objects. But these objects are not pre-given things that consciousness then represents. Rather, consciousness actively constitutes its objects through what Husserl called temporal synthesis. When you perceive a coffee cup, you're not receiving data about an independent object and constructing an interface representation. You're actively synthesizing a sequence of experiences, different profiles of the cup seen from different angles, into the unified meaning coffee cup. The object emerges through consciousness's activity. What Hoffman calls interface, Husserl would call the result of consciousness's meaning-making activity. But this isn't deception or illusion. It's how consciousness operates. There's no real coffee cup behind your experience to which your perception might or might not correspond. So, Husserl would reject Hoffman's entire problematic. The question isn't whether our perceptions accurately represent reality independent of consciousness. It's how consciousness structures experience to create meaningful worlds. Rather than asking whether evolution has deceived us about reality, we should ask, what are the universal structures of consciousness that make any experience possible? How does consciousness constitute objects, meanings, other subjects? Husserl would see Hoffman's theory as asking the wrong questions. The task isn't to escape our perceptual limitations to reach reality, as it is independent of consciousness. The task is to understand consciousness itself, the only access to reality we have or could ever have. These four responses to Hoffman's interface theory reveal something profound. How we interpret radical scientific theories depends deeply on our prior philosophical commitments. Kant shows us the self-refutation problem. Any theory that claims our cognitive faculties are fundamentally unreliable undermines its own grounds for claiming to be true. This suggests we need to preserve some trust in reason, even if we acknowledge its evolutionary origins. Berkeley reminds us that denying material reality doesn't automatically preserve objectivity. Without some objective ground, we risk sliding into radical relativism, where every perspective creates its own incompatible reality. Schopenhauer forces us to confront the existential implications. If Hoffman is right, what happens to human meaning, authentic relationships, and the value of knowledge itself? Can we maintain care and commitment while believing we're trapped in evolutionary illusions? And Husserl reframes the entire problem. Perhaps the question isn't whether our perceptions are accurate representations of independent reality, but rather how consciousness operates to constitute meaningful experience. This shifts our focus from skeptical worry to careful investigation. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from both Hoffman and our four great philosophers is this: consciousness is far stranger and more fundamental than common sense suggests. Whether we understand it through Kant's transcendental structures, Berkeley's divine ideas, Schopenhauer's blind will, or Husserl's intentional synthesis, consciousness emerges as the creative principle that makes any world possible. The question isn't whether to trust our perceptions. We have no choice but to work with them. The question is how to remain aware that our perceptions are constructions, shaped by evolution, culture, and individual history, rather than transparent windows onto reality. This awareness doesn't paralyze us with skepticism. Instead, it opens us to other perspectives, other ways of experiencing and understanding the world. It makes us humble about our claims to absolute truth, while committed to pursuing truth as carefully as we can. The interface might be all we have, but recognizing it as an interface, rather than mistaking it for reality itself, might be the beginning of wisdom.